Blackwood Valley, the American West. A stormy midnight. Wyatt Hayes had his rifle up, finger on the trigger, aimed straight at the figure crouched in the dark corner of his barn. A young woman, soaking wet, shaking hard. But her eyes didn't beg. Slowly, without a word, she pulled down the torn fabric at her shoulder. Wyatt went still. A fresh burn. Deep, deliberate. 2 letters seared into her skin like a brand on livestock. TV, the rifle came down. "Please," she whispered. "Just look." And that was the moment everything changed. A broken hunter, an unbroken woman, and a fight that would set an entire valley free. If you want to know what happens next, it starts right below. The storm hit hard around midnight. Rain came down in sheets, hammering the tin roof of Wyatt Hayes's barn like it had a grudge. Thunder rolled across the flats in long, low waves, and the darkness between lightning strikes was the kind of dark that swallowed everything whole. Wyatt was already awake. He'd been awake for hours, sitting in the chair by the window with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Sleep didn't come easy anymore. Hadn't for years. Then he heard it. A scrape. Something shifting in the barn. A boot heel on old wood, maybe, or a hand knocking against a feed bucket in the dark. He was on his feet before the sound finished. Rifle off the wall in one smooth motion, boots on without lacing, coat thrown over his shoulders, and nothing else. He'd crossed the yard through the downpour in under 10 seconds. Rain soaked through his shirt and ran cold down the back of his neck. He didn't feel it. He eased through the barn's side door, slow, back pressed to the wood frame, and stood still. The horses were restless, both of them stamping, ears pinned flat. That told him everything. Someone was in here who didn't belong. He lit the lantern on the post with one hand, kept the rifle raised with the other, and swung left into the darkness. "Don't move." His voice came out low, controlled. The voice of a man who had said those 2 words 100 times before and never once needed to say them twice. The lantern light swayed and caught the figure, crouched behind the stack of hay bales at the far wall. Small, slight, pressed so far into the corner that she'd practically tried to push herself through the wood. Her arms were wrapped around something, a parcel of some kind, bound in old leather and clutched to her chest, like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth. She was soaking wet, shaking hard. Her clothes were little more than rags, torn at the hem, the sleeve of her dress half gone, and her bare feet were dark with mud and cuts. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She just looked up at him. Her eyes, wide and dark and burning with something that had nothing to do with fear, locked straight onto his face. Wyatt kept the rifle on her. He'd learned a long time ago not to let the optics of a situation cloud his judgment. Small didn't mean harmless. Desperate certainly didn't. "Who are you?" he said. She opened her mouth, and what came out was barely a sound at all. Her lips moved around words. Her voice couldn't carry yet. "I'm not," she swallowed. Tried again. "I'm not here to take anything. You're in my barn in the middle of the night." "I know." She nodded once, quickly. "I know. I'm sorry I didn't have anywhere else." Her voice cracked clean down the middle, and she stopped herself, pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. "I just needed somewhere to get out of the rain." He didn't lower the rifle. He'd heard a lot of stories at gunpoint over the years. He'd heard stories that could break your heart, and stories that could turn your stomach, and stories so creative they almost deserved applause. He had learned, through hard and bloody experience, that the story didn't matter. What mattered was the threat. What mattered was the gun. "That parcel," he said. "What's in it?" Her arms tightened around it instinctively, just for a second. Then she seemed to catch herself doing it, and she made herself stop. "Papers. Papers. My father's papers." Lightning hit somewhere close, and the whole barn went white for half a second. In that flash, Wyatt got a better look at her face. She was young, mid-20s at the most, pretty under the dirt and the hollow, sunken look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in a long time. But her jaw was set hard, and her eyes hadn't dropped away from his for a single second since he'd lit that lantern. Most men looked away at the rifle. She hadn't. "Stand up," he said. She stood, slowly, carefully, and with some effort, like her body was arguing with her about it. She was about 5.5 feet tall. Her dress, what was left of it, hung loose on a frame that was too thin. The leather parcel she kept pressed to her ribs like armor. Wyatt's finger rested easy against the trigger guard. "Old habit. Who owns you?" he asked. "Who's going to come looking?" Something moved across her face. Quick, sharp, like he'd just slapped her. "Nobody owns me," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him for a long moment. The lantern swung between them in a draft and cast her shadow long against the hay. Then she did something he wasn't expecting. She shifted the parcel under one arm, reached up with her other hand, and slowly pulled down the torn fabric at her shoulder. Wyatt didn't move. She held it there, that ruined piece of cloth, and she just stood still, letting him see. He'd worked as a bounty hunter for over 15 years. He'd ridden into hellholes and dragged men out of them. He'd seen bodies left in the sun for days. He'd seen what people could do to each other when no one was watching. He had, in his life, believed himself to be past the point of shock. He was wrong. Her shoulder was a geography of suffering. Old scars ran in pale, thick lines across her skin, years of them layered over each other, the kind that came from a leather whip, applied with patience and purpose. They told a story that was long and deliberate and cold, but those weren't what his eyes stopped on. There was a brand, fresh, maybe 2 or 3 days old at most. The skin around it was an angry, weeping red, swollen in a wide ring, and the mark itself was still raw and dark at the edges. 2 letters burned deep and permanent into the flesh of her shoulder. TV, Thaddeus Vance. Wyatt had heard of Vance. Everyone in 3 counties had heard of Vance. The cattle baron who owned Blackwood Valley, the way a boot owned the ground it stood on. The man who had judges and sheriffs and county commissioners folded up neat in his breast pocket. The man who, apparently, branded human beings. "Please," she said quietly. Her voice didn't shake this time. It was past shaking. "Just look." He was already looking. He couldn't stop. His rifle came down. He wasn't thinking about it. His arms just lowered it, slow until the barrel pointed at the barn floor. Some things the body understood before the mind got around to it. Some things bypassed all that hard-built armor and landed somewhere deeper, somewhere that hadn't been touched in years. This was a person. This was what had been done to a person. The woman pulled her torn sleeve back up over her shoulder with careful, practiced movements. The way you adjusted something you'd long ago made your peace with having to adjust. She watched him lower the rifle, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. "My name is Josie," she said. "Josephine Mercer. My father worked as an accountant for Thaddeus Vance." She paused. "He's dead now, and they'll kill me too if they find me." Wyatt stood in the rain-hammered dark of his barn and looked at her. 15 years of bounty hunting. A life deliberately pared down to nothing and no one. A ranch at the edge of nowhere, chosen precisely because nothing out here required him to care about anything. He looked at the parcel in her arms. He looked at the set of her jaw and the fire still alive in her eyes even now, even after whatever road had brought her through that storm to his barn door. He looked at the place on her shoulder where a man had pressed hot iron against her skin and called it ownership. Wyatt Hayes set his rifle against the wall. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put some water on." The rain stopped sometime before dawn. Wyatt knew, because he'd been awake, to hear it. He'd sat in the chair beside the small cot in the back room, watching Josie sleep, listening to the storm thin itself out until all that was left was the drip from the eaves and the distant rumble of thunder moving east. Then nothing, just the dark and the quiet and the sound of her breathing. She'd eaten a little. Not much. Half a bowl of salt pork and beans that he'd warmed over the stove, and she'd eaten it slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned that eating too fast after going without was its own kind of punishment. She hadn't talked much either. She'd answered what he asked, name, where she'd come from, how long she'd been running, and she'd done it in short. Direct sentences that didn't waste a single word. Then her eyes had started losing the battle against exhaustion, and he'd pointed her to the cot, and she'd been out within 2 minutes. He'd meant to sleep in the main room. He'd pulled the chair up just to sit for a moment, just to think through what exactly he'd gotten himself into. That was 5 hours ago. Wyatt stretched his neck, set down his cold coffee cup, and walked to the window. The sky over the eastern ridge was going gray at the bottom, dawn coming on slow and pale, washing the color out of everything, before it decided what color to put back in. The yard was muddy and pocked with rain craters. The barn doors were still latched from last night. His 2 horses were quiet now. He thought about what she'd said at the table, between spoonfuls of beans. 8 years. She'd given 8 years to Vance's operation, working off a debt that wasn't hers, a debt Vance had manufactured out of nothing after her father died. Debt that grew every month she worked. Interest compounding the way injustice always compounds, when the man collecting it also writes the rules. She'd finally run 3 nights ago, after Vance's men had held her down in the yard and burned his initials into her shoulder as a warning to the others. Wyatt had heard her say all of it in that flat, controlled voice, and he'd sat across the table and kept his own face still, because the alternative was putting his fist through the wall. He'd done that once before in his life, over something smaller than this. He'd broken 2 knuckles. He turned away from the window and put more wood on the stove. He was frying some salt pork and boiling coffee when he heard the dogs. Not one dog. A pack of them. Deep-chested, baying things. Voices carrying clean across the flat, wet ground from the south road. The kind of hounds men used when they were tracking something they didn't intend to lose. Wyatt pulled the skillet off the heat. He walked to the back room and put a hand on Josie's shoulder, the good one, and she came awake fast. No groggy middle stage, straight from sleep to alert. Her hand went under the blanket before she was even fully upright. "Dogs," he said. Coming up from the south, she was on her feet before he finished the sentence. She grabbed the leather parcel from under the cot mattress where she'd shoved it and pressed it to her chest. "How many men?" "Can't tell yet. Stay in here. Don't come out. Don't make noise. Don't open that door unless I tell you to." She looked at him. For a second, just one, he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not fear exactly. More like the calculation of someone running odds in their head and not loving what they added up to. "Okay," she said. He closed the door between them. He pulled on his coat, took his Winchester down from the wall, loaded it with the calm efficiency of long practice, and walked out onto the porch. There were 4 of them. They came up the road in no particular hurry, which was the kind of confidence that came from knowing you had more guns and more dogs than whatever you were riding toward. The hounds ran out ahead, 3 of them, big, rangy animals with their noses to the ground and their ears dragging. They hit the yard and fanned out immediately, circling the barn, and the biggest one, black and tan with a chest like a barrel, broke from the pack and charged straight for the barn doors. The man riding point reined in about 20 feet from the porch. He was built wide and lean. At the same time, the kind of man who'd been hard used by weather and hard work, and had come out of it meaner for the experience. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His eyes were flat and pale as river ice. Boone Wyatt had heard the name. Everyone in the county had heard the name, the same way they'd heard rattlesnakes described before they'd seen one. The 3 riders behind Boone spread out in a loose line, hands near their holsters. Trying to look casual about it, Wyatt stood on the porch with his Winchester at his side, not raised. "Just there." "Morning," Boone said. He didn't sound like he thought it was a good one. "Morning," Wyatt said. Boone looked at the barn, looked at the hounds working the perimeter. The big black and tan had its nose jammed against the gap under the barn doors and was baying loud enough to wake the dead. "Lost something last night," Boone said. "Storm scattered one of Mr. Vance's workers. Young woman. Mr. Vance is concerned about her welfare." Wyatt looked at him. Mr. Vance, he said, sends 4 armed men and a pack of hunting hounds when he's concerned about someone's welfare. Boone's expression didn't change. The woman's confused. She stole property that belongs to Mr. Vance and ran off in a state. We're just here to bring her back safe. The big hound had worked itself into a frenzy now. It left the barn doors and came tearing across the yard toward the house, baying and snapping, hell-bent on something it had scented on the porch steps, or maybe through the window. It was fast, and it was mean, and it wasn't slowing down. Wyatt raised the Winchester and shot it dead at 30 feet. The crack of the rifle split the morning wide open. The hound went down mid-stride, rolled once, and was still. The other 2 dogs broke and scattered, yelping, and the horses behind Boone shied and stamped, and one of the riders cursed, trying to keep his seat. The yard went quiet. Wyatt levered a fresh round into the chamber and raised the smoking barrel until it was pointed squarely at the center of Boone's forehead. Boone had gone very still. His pale eyes were steady, but his jaw had tightened up, and his right hand had stopped its casual drift toward his holster because he was smart enough to know the arithmetic didn't work in his favor. On my land, Wyatt said, people aren't cattle for you to herd with dogs. His voice was quiet. No heat in it. That was the thing about men who'd lived the life Wyatt had lived. They didn't need to raise their voices to mean what they said. You've got workers, he continued. You've got neighbors. You ride out to them if you've got concerns. He kept the barrel where it was, rock steady. Get off my property before I turn you into fertilizer. Nobody moved for a long moment. One of the riders behind Boone shifted in his saddle, and Wyatt's eyes cut to him fast, just a flick, enough to make the man freeze. Boone looked at the dead hound, then at Wyatt, then at the Winchester. He was doing math. Finally, he pulled his reins left, slow and deliberate, like the slowness was his choice and not something imposed on him. Mr. Vance is going to want a conversation with you, he said. Tell him he knows where I live, Wyatt said. Boone held his eyes for another moment, then turned his horse and rode back down the road the way he'd come. The other 3 fell in behind him. The remaining hounds caught up to the horses and ran alongside, tails down, something broken out of them. Wyatt stood on the porch until they were out of sight around the bend. Then he lowered the rifle and let out a breath. He heard the back door open. Then footsteps. Then Josie appeared, at the corner of the house, the parcel tucked under her arm, her eyes moving from him to the road, to the dead hound in the yard, and back to him. You didn't have to do that, she said. The dog was going to go through the wall to get to you. She was quiet for a moment. They'll come back. Yes, Wyatt said. They will. He turned and looked at her. She was standing in the pale morning light, with mud between her bare toes and her hair coming loose from whatever she'd tied it with. And she was looking back at him with those steady dark eyes that hadn't broken once since he'd put a rifle on her in his barn. Most people, he thought, after 8 years of what she'd survived, would have something extinguished in their eyes. Some essential thing snuffed out. Whatever that essential thing was in Josie Mercer, it was still burning. Come inside, he said. Your breakfast got cold. I'll heat it back up. She looked at the dead hound one more time. Then she followed him in. They ate without talking much. Wyatt refilled both their coffee cups. Outside, the sun was coming up properly now, burning the last of the storm haze off the flats, and the yard was steaming faintly where the light hit the wet ground. Josie wrapped both hands around her cup and stared at the table. He won't send Boone next time, she said. He'll come himself, or he'll send more men, more guns, probably. This isn't your fight. Wyatt looked at her over his cup. You're on my land. That makes it my fight, she frowned. That's not a good enough reason to get yourself killed. Nobody's getting killed today. He set his cup down. You said your father kept records. The ledger, she looked up. You said papers in that parcel. You said your father was an accountant. Her hands tightened around the cup. Yes. What kind of records? She held his gaze for a long moment, measuring him in some way he couldn't quite read. Whatever she found in his face must have been sufficient, because she reached for the leather parcel beside her chair. "The kind," she said quietly, "that would put Thaddeus Vance in a federal prison." Wyatt nodded once, slow. He reached for the coffee pot. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a runaway worker and a pack of dogs. He'd known it the moment he'd pulled down the barrel last night in the barn. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unknow. Some decisions, once made, can't be walked back. He'd made his decision on that barn floor. He refilled her cup without being asked. Outside, the sun kept rising, indifferent and bright, over a valley that Thaddeus Vance believed he owned entirely. He was about to find out he was wrong. The fever came on the second night. Wyatt had seen it, building through the day. The flush in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat, the way she'd gone quiet at dinner, quieter than usual, which was saying something. The careful, stiff way she held her left shoulder, like keeping it still was the only thing standing between her and something worse. He'd changed the dressing on the brand that afternoon. He'd done it without ceremony, set out the clean cloth, and the herbs he'd kept for exactly this kind of need, told her to sit at the kitchen table, and she'd sat. She hadn't made a sound when he cleaned it, not one, though he could see by the tension in every muscle of her back what it cost her. The wound was angry, red in a way that had spread past the original margins of the burn, heat radiating off it that he could feel through the cloth. He'd known then. He'd hoped. He was wrong. He wasn't. By midnight, she was burning up. He found her on the cot with her eyes open, glassy and unfocused, her lips moving around words that weren't making it all the way out. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead and pulled it back fast. He didn't sleep after that. He made a poultice from what he had, dried yarrow and comfrey, a remedy he'd learned from necessity more than education, from years of patching himself up in places where a doctor was 2 days' ride in the wrong direction. He kept the cloth cool and changed it every hour. He boiled water with willow bark and got as much of it into her as she'd take, which wasn't much. When she shook, he added a blanket. When the sweating started, he pulled it back. He talked to her sometimes. Not about anything important, just words to give her something to follow back. He told her about the ranch, the 2 horses, the way the light came off the ridge in late afternoon, things he'd never told anyone because there'd never been anyone to tell. He sat in that chair and talked to the dark in a low, even voice, and at some point, around 4 in the morning, she stopped shaking so hard. The fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. Wyatt was at the stove when he heard the cot creak, then silence, then her voice, rough and dry. "Is there water?" He brought it to her. She pushed herself up against the wall and took the cup in both hands and drank without stopping. He refilled it. She drank half of that one, too. She looked like a woman who had been through a war and won by the narrowest possible margin. Her eyes were clear again, though. That was the thing he'd been watching for. Whatever the fever had tried to take from her, it hadn't managed to get that. "How long?" she asked. 2.5 days. She closed her eyes briefly. "You stayed. You were sick." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like someone encountering a thing they'd been told existed, but hadn't expected to actually meet. "Thank you," she said. "Eat something first, then rest. Then we'll talk." She ate, slowly, methodically, the same way she'd eaten that first night. When she was done, she lay back down and slept for another 4 hours. And when she woke the second time, she was close enough to herself that the difference was clear even to Wyatt, who hadn't known her long enough to have a strong baseline. She sat up, reached under the mattress, and pulled out the leather parcel. She set it on her lap and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him, standing in the doorway. "Sit down," she said. "I'll show you what I've been carrying." He pulled the chair over and sat. The leather was old and worn, the ties knotted multiple times and retied, the edges dark with handling. She undid the knots with fingers that were still a little clumsy from the fever and opened it flat across her legs. It wasn't one thing. It was a collection of them. Folded papers, tight and precise. Pages covered in columns of numbers. Careful, miniature handwriting that had been done with the attention of someone who understood that accuracy was everything. Receipts, dates, names, amounts, and underneath all of it, a small bound journal, its cover soft with age. Josie picked up the journal. My father's name was Robert Mercer, she said. He was an accountant, a good one. Thaddeus Vance hired him 15 years ago to manage his books. She turned the journal over in her hands. My father was an honest man. That was his problem. Wyatt waited. Vance's operation was never just cattle, she said. The cattle were the face of it. The thing he showed the county. But underneath it, he was running weapons to 3 different outlaw outfits up in the territories. He was bribing Judge Calloway to dismiss land disputes in his favor. He was buying up deeds from families who owed back taxes, and those taxes were wrong, inflated by men Vance had in the assessor's office. She opened the journal to the middle and turned it to face him. My father recorded all of it. Every transaction, every bribe. He put it in the real ledger and kept a fake one for Vance to show the authorities. Wyatt leaned forward and looked at the page. Columns of numbers. Dates going back over a decade. Initials beside certain entries. A cipher of some kind, organized and deliberate. He kept this, Wyatt said, instead of destroying it. He was going to go to the federal marshal in Tucson. She closed the journal. He died before he could. Vance's men said it was a riding accident. My father hadn't ridden a horse in 10 years. He had bad knees. Wyatt sat back. So they killed him, he said. Yes, and then Vance came after you. He said my father owed him, that Robert Mercer had embezzled from him. Her voice was flat, matter of fact, but her hands on the journal had gone tight. He showed a ledger, a different one, made up numbers that added up to a debt of $1,200. She shook her head. I was 19. I didn't have $1,200. I didn't have 12, so they took the debt out in labor. She paused. 8 years, and the real ledger. Vance didn't know my father had kept it. He'd searched our house after the funeral. He didn't find it. She pressed her hand flat on the cover of the journal. My father hid it with me, told me what it was, what it proved, told me to protect it and wait for the right moment to take it to someone who could use it. She looked up. The week after I turned up at your barn, Vance announced, he was moving me to his operation up north. I would have disappeared, so I ran. The room was quiet. Outside, a bird called once, twice, then stopped. Wyatt looked at the journal. He looked at the papers spread around it. A decade of evidence. Bribes, weapons running, land theft, murder made to look like an accident. Names and amounts and dates, recorded by a careful, honest man who had known what it would cost him and had done it anyway. This wasn't just a woman on the run from a cattle baron. This was the kind of evidence that brought down entire systems. Judges, assessors. Every man Vance had bought over a decade. The whole rotten structure of a valley that one man had decided belonged to him. Josie, he said. Every lawman in Blackwood County is on Vance's payroll. I know, so we can't go local. No. He rubbed his jaw. There's a man, Doc Garza, Mateo Garza. He's got an office in Crestfall near the border. He's a doctor, but he's got a law degree too. More than that, he's the only man in 3 counties that Vance hasn't been able to buy or frighten. He paused. He's been trying to build a case against Vance for years. Nobody would give him what he needed. Josie looked at the journal in her hands. This is what he needed, she said. Yes. She nodded once slowly. Then we go to Doc Garza. Wyatt looked at her. The fever had taken something out of her. The past 3 days had cost her something. And still, she was sitting up straight with that journal in her lap, and her eyes clear, and her jaw set. No hesitation. No asking him to carry the weight of the decision for her. Just a straight line between here and what needed to happen next. He stood, crossed to the window, and looked out at the yard, the road, the flat distance where it bent south. We'll need a few days before you're strong enough to ride, and we'll need to move careful. Vance's men will be watching the main roads. I can ride now if I have to. You had a fever 3 hours ago. I've done worse things in worse shape. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, and he believed her, because looking at her, it was very easy to believe that she had. 2 days, he said. Rest 2 days, then we move. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. She began retying the parcel. Those careful, precise knots, methodical and exact. He was almost back to the doorway when she spoke again. Wyatt, he stopped. She was looking down at the parcel, working the last knot. Why did you lower the rifle? That first night, in the barn? He was quiet for a moment. Because of what I saw, he said. Plenty of men see things like that and don't lower their rifles. He didn't have an answer for that. That was easy to put into words. The brand, the letters burned into her skin, the specific brutality of a man who believed so completely in his own ownership of other people that he marked them the way you'd mark your livestock. There was no way to look at that and pretend you hadn't seen it, not if you still had anything human left in you. I know, he said. I've met some of those men. She looked up. I was one of them, he said quietly. For a long time, I saw things and I kept walking. He met her eyes. I got tired of who I was turning into. She looked at him for a long moment. There was no pity in it, no judgment, just that straight, clear, measuring look. Then she looked back down at the parcel. 2 days, she said, then we go. He nodded and left her to rest. But first, he picked up his knife from the kitchen table where he'd left it. He stood over the dry sink and looked at his own hand. The palm, the old scars already there, from a life badly lived and slowly corrected. He was still thinking about that moment in the barn when he'd gotten his first clear look at her shoulder. The deliberateness of it, the message it was meant to send to everyone who saw it. This person belongs to me, marked like property. Like she was less than human, like her skin was just another surface for a man with power and no conscience to write on. He'd watched her all through the fever, half out of her head and still fighting it, still holding on to that parcel even in sleep, still pulling herself back every time the fever tried to drag her under. 8 years of it. 8 years, and she'd come through it with her mind intact and a ledger full of evidence and a plan. A monster had tried to put him on her. He'd failed. Wyatt went to find her where she'd laid back down, already half asleep again, the parcel tucked against her side. He sat in the chair. He looked at her shoulder where the cloth covered the brand. He picked up the knife. Slowly, without drama, he drew a shallow cut across his own left palm, hissed once through his teeth at the sting. Let it bleed a little, just enough to make it real. Her eyes opened. She looked at the knife, the cut, his face. He held his palm out. Open. Scars aren't a villain's mark, Josie, he said. They're a badge proving you survived. She looked at his hand for a long moment, at the fresh cut, at the older ones beneath it. Then she reached out and wrapped her hand around his. Not tight, just present. Her fingers were warm. Warmer than they should have been, maybe, but the fever was gone, and what was left was just her. They stayed like that for a while. Outside, the sun moved across the valley. The horses were quiet in the barn. Somewhere down the south road, men were planning something. There would be more guns coming. There would be more dogs. But not today. Today, there was just a man and a woman in a small back room, both of them scarred, both of them holding on, and the thin silver light of an afternoon that belonged, for this one moment, entirely to them. 2 days passed, slow and strange. Josie slept more than she expected to and ate more than she thought she could manage and said less than either of those things. Wyatt didn't push her for conversation. He moved through his own routines with a kind of deliberate quiet, feeding the horses before dawn, checking the south road from the ridge twice a day, fixing things around the property that Josie suspected he'd been letting sit for a while. He wasn't a man who talked to fill silence. She respected that enormously. On the afternoon of the second day, she felt well enough to sit outside on the porch steps. The air was dry and hot and smelled like dust and something wild she couldn't name. She had the parcel in her lap, which was habit now, same as breathing. She sat with it and watched the road and let the sun press down on her shoulders and thought about her father. Robert Mercer had been a quiet man, too. Small and precise, ink-stained fingers, A laugh he saved for things that genuinely earned it. He'd taught her numbers before she could read properly, shown her how a ledger worked, how every entry on one side had to be answered on the other, how the whole thing balanced or it told a lie. He'd said that was true of more than accounting. He'd said that was true of most things in life. She pressed her hand flat on the leather of the parcel. He'd been right about that. On the morning they were set to leave, Wyatt came out of the barn leading both horses, saddled and provisioned. He'd packed light and smart, she noticed. Bedrolls, food for 4 days, extra ammunition, organized neatly in his saddlebag. The man did not pack the way someone packed, who was uncertain about what he might need. He packed like someone who had been wrong about that before and didn't intend to repeat it. He handed her the reins of the brown mare. "Her name's Calla," he said. "She's steady. She won't spook in the canyon if we hit rough ground." Josie took the reins, ran her hand down the mare's neck. Calla turned her head and looked at her with one large liquid eye and went back to ignoring everything, which was exactly what Josie wanted in a horse right now. "The route?" she asked. "We go south through the canyon, then cut east along the dry wash. Stays off the main road. Adds about 4 hours." "That's fine." He nodded. He was about to mount up when he stopped. He looked at her for a moment, measuring something. "Before we go," he said, "come here." She followed him to the fence post at the edge of the yard. He reached into his coat and drew out the Colt revolver at his hip. Not his rifle. The handgun. He turned it over in his hands once and held it out to her, grip first. She looked at it, then at him. "Take it," he said. She took it. It was heavier than she'd expected. Not that she hadn't held a gun before. She'd held one twice in her life, but there was a difference between touching one and holding one like it was actually yours. "Have you fired before?" "Twice," she said. "Neither time I was trying to hit anything." He almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost. Stand here." The post. He stepped in behind her, and she felt it immediately. The shift in air, the presence of him, broad and solid at her back. His hands came around her, one adjusting her grip on the revolver, the other pressing lightly at her shoulder to correct her stance. "Feet apart," he said, close to her ear. "Left foot forward. You're not a statue. You need to be able to absorb the kick." She adjusted, elbow in slightly. "Don't lock your wrist." His hand moved to her elbow and pressed it to where he wanted it. His voice was low and even and professional. Teaching voice. She focused on what he was saying, and not on the fact that his chest was pressed flat against her back, or that when he spoke, the words brushed past her ear, and she could smell tobacco and leather, and something else underneath both of those. Things faint and dry like desert sage after rain. She raised the gun toward the fence post at the far end of the yard. His hands stilled. He was supposed to say something. She could tell, by the small pause, the breath he drew in to speak. But the breath came in, and the words didn't follow immediately, and she felt, through the contact between his chest and her back, the change in his heartbeat. He was a man who had, in all likelihood, never been rattled by anything in his adult life. She'd seen him face down 4 armed men and a pack of hunting dogs, without his pulse visibly shifting. She had watched him sit through 2.5 days of nursing a feverish stranger, without once betraying frustration or impatience, or anything other than steady, focused calm. His hands, she realized, were not entirely steady. Not the left one, the one still resting lightly at her elbow. There was a very slight tremor in it, controlled quickly and firmly, but present, like a man who had discovered abruptly and without prior warning that something mattered to him. He stepped back, not far, just enough. "Line up the sights," he said, and his voice was the same as it always was. Controlled even, front sight between the 2 rear notches. "Keep both eyes open." She lined up the sights on the far post. "Breathe out," he said. And at the bottom of that breath, "Pull, don't jerk. Pull," she breathed out. She pulled. The gun kicked hard and the sound cracked across the flat open yard, and the post at the far end jumped and splintered at the top corner. The silence after was bright and ringing. Wyatt looked at the post, looked at it for a moment. Good, he said. That was all. She lowered the gun and turned to face him. He was looking at the post still, giving himself one more second before he looked at her. And she understood that. She used the second herself. He turned, and their eyes met, and something passed between them that neither of them had a word for, and neither of them tried to name. He reached out toward the Colt. She didn't hand it back. He stopped. It's your life, he said quietly. You have to be the one to pull the trigger to protect it. She looked at the gun in her hand, then at him. He wasn't offering to protect her. He wasn't telling her she needed him, or that she'd be helpless without him. He was handing her the thing itself, the choice, the ability, the right. She turned the gun and holstered it in the empty holster on the saddlebag he'd rigged for her. She patted it once, just to feel it there. Then let's ride, she said. They made good time through the morning. Wyatt led and Josie rode close behind, Calla proving herself to be exactly as steady as advertised. They left the main road within the first half-mile and dropped into the canyon country, where the walls rose up on both sides and the sound of the horses' hooves went flat and close in the narrow passages. Wyatt didn't talk much as they rode. He watched the ridgeline. Josie watched them too. She'd been watching ridgelines for 3 days now, scanning for movement, for the glint of sun off a rifle barrel, and she'd gotten efficient at it. Her eyes swept and returned and swept again without her having to think about it. They stopped midday in the shade of a red rock overhang, watered the horses from the canteen, ate dried meat and hard bread. Josie sat on a flat rock and watched him water the horses. She thought about the shooting lesson. The way he'd stepped back when he felt his own hands shake, that had been honesty in its way. He hadn't tried to cover it, or push through it, or pretend it wasn't happening. He'd just stepped back and given her room. She'd seen men do far worse, with smaller feelings than whatever was happening between them. Not that she knew exactly what was happening between them. She was 26 years old and had spent most of her adult life indentured to a cattle baron who thought she was property. She had not had a great deal of opportunity to learn what it felt like when a man respected her. This was what it felt like, apparently. Strange and steady and a little frightening, and something else underneath all of that which she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. You went quiet, Wyatt said. She looked up. He was watching her with those dark, careful eyes. I'm often quiet, she said. Different quiet, he said. You're thinking about something. She looked down at the parcel in her lap. I was thinking about Doc Garza. What happens after we hand this over? He accepted that, sat down on the rock across from her, and drank from the canteen. Garza files with the federal marshal in Tucson, he said. Evidence of this quality, they'll have to move. Vance's judges are county level. Federal jurisdiction supersedes them, and the land takes longer. But it comes. Back. Deeds filed under fraud get unwound. He looked at the rock face. It won't be fast. Nothing like this is fast, but it moves. She nodded. What about you? He asked. She looked up. After, he said. What do you do? She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it a great deal during those fever days when she wasn't really conscious, and the thoughts had come and gone without her full permission. I don't know, she said honestly. I've been pointed at this one thing for so long I'm not sure what's on the other side of it. He was quiet for a moment. You could stay, he said. It came out simple and unadorned, and she had the impression he'd been as surprised to say it as she was to hear it. He didn't elaborate. He didn't dress it up or walk it back or explain what he meant by it. He just let it sit there between them on the hot, flat air of the canyon. She looked at him. We should keep moving, she said. Yes, he said. He stood and went back to the horses, and neither of them said anything else about it, and the canyon closed around them again as they rode, and the afternoon stretched out long and golden, and full of everything that hadn't been said yet. They rode for Doc Garza through the long afternoon and into the early evening, and Crestfall appeared at dusk, like a smudge of light against the dark flats, small and wind-scored, and exactly the kind of town that never appeared on maps anyone important was using. Doc Garza was real. That was the first thing Josie thought when she saw him. Not in the sense of his being physically present, she'd expected that, but in the sense that he looked like what he was without apology. A lean, dark-eyed man in his late 60s, with the brown, weathered face of someone who spent time outdoors, and the careful hands of someone who spent it helping people. He opened his door at Wyatt's knock and looked at them both and didn't ask a single unnecessary question. Just stepped back and let them in. He read the ledger for 2 hours while they ate at his table. Neither of them spoke much while he read. Josie watched his face and tracked the small changes in his expression as he moved through the pages. Tightening around the eyes at the weapons entries. A long stillness at the section on Judge Calloway, his mouth pressing flat when he hit the land deed material. When he finally set it down, he looked at Josie for a long time. "Your father was a brave man," he said. She nodded. She trusted her voice with that much, and not much more. "This is enough," Doc said. He pressed his hand flat on the journal. "This is more than enough. I'll have papers to the federal marshal by the end of the week. They'll move on this, Josephine. I promise you." She believed him. She didn't know him well enough to have earned that belief, but she believed him anyway. Looking at his face, the absolute absence of anything evasive or calculating in it. They left Crestfall before dawn the next morning. Going back felt different from going out. The mission was delivered. The ledger was in the right hands. Josie should have felt lighter. Partly she did. But the closer they rode back toward Wyatt's ranch, the more something else moved in, underneath that lightness, low and complicated, something that had to do with what came next, and whether she was ready for it. She wasn't sure she was, but she rode toward it anyway, because that was what she did. She always had. They were halfway back when the storm built on the western horizon, and by the time they entered Deadman's Canyon, the sky had gone the color of a bruise. The canyon was wrong from the first step into it. Wyatt felt it before he saw anything. That low, specific pressure that settled at the base of his skull when his instincts were trying to get ahead of his conscious mind. He'd learned, over 15 years of hunting men in bad places, to listen to that pressure without negotiating with it. He slowed his horse. Josie came up even with him without being asked, which told him she felt it too. The canyon walls rose 60 feet on both sides, red and pale gold, narrowing ahead to a passage maybe 30 feet across, before it opened back out into the flats. The light was wrong. The sky above the canyon rim had gone a dark amber yellow, and the air had thickened, and the horses were both breathing in short, tight pulls. "Sandstorm," Wyatt said. He'd barely gotten the word out before it hit. It came over the western rim of the canyon like a wall. Not sand exactly, more like the world just deciding to become a different material. Everything going brown and roaring, visibility dropping to 10 feet, then 5, then nothing you'd want to bet your life on. Calla shied hard, and Josie brought her back with both hands and a grip that didn't quit, and Wyatt pulled his own horse left toward the canyon wall to get out of the main channel of it. "Stay with me," he called. "Ride left toward the wall." She was already moving. They pushed up against the rock face, close as they could get, and the storm screamed past them like something furious, like it had somewhere to be and resented the delay. Wyatt pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth. He'd had enough sense to find Josie a spare piece of cloth that morning. He saw her do the same. He couldn't hear anything except the wind, which was why he didn't hear the riders until they were close enough to touch. The shot came from above and to the right, off the east rim. It hit the canyon floor 6 inches from his horse's front hoof, and the animal screamed and reared, and Wyatt stayed on it by pure muscle memory, wrenching the reins and driving his heels in, and talking the horse back down with his voice before his mind had finished, registering what had happened. More shots. 4, 5, from different points along the rim. Not aimed to hit, not yet. Aimed to confuse, to scatter, to drive them into the open. Left, get behind the rocks. There was a formation on the left wall, a tumble of old boulders at the base of the cliff. Wyatt drove toward it and heard Josie right behind him. They hit the rocks and came off the horses in the same motion and pulled the animals down and in behind the largest boulder. Wyatt had his rifle out. He scanned the rim through the blowing sand and caught movement, at least 5 men spread out along the east ridge, positioned before the storm hit, set up and waiting. This wasn't opportunistic. This was a planned interception, which meant someone had known they were going to dock Garza, which meant someone had talked or someone had watched, and either way, Vance had known before they'd made the ride. The shots came in harder now, kicking off the canyon walls, ricocheting in directions you couldn't track properly, which was the particular misery of a canyon firefight. Sound became useless as a guide. You couldn't trust your ears. You had to see them. Wyatt put the rifle to his shoulder and sighted through the blowing sand and waited. A shape resolved on the rim. He fired. The shape went flat. He didn't know if he'd hit, or the man had just dropped, but the position went quiet. Josie was beside him, the Colt in both hands, tracking right along the base of the opposite wall. 2 riders coming down the south passage, she said, trying to get below us. How many? 2 I can see. Take the closer one if they clear that formation. She didn't answer him. She tracked and waited, and when the rider cleared the rock formation, she fired once. The horse shied and bolted, and the rider grabbed leather and pulled back. She'd missed the man, but removed him as an immediate problem, which was almost as good. Wyatt moved left, crouching, trying to get a better angle on the rim. He didn't see the man at the canyon floor level until too late. The shot came from almost directly behind them. He spun and saw the muzzle flash through the sand. 15 feet, one of Vance's men had worked around the boulder on foot, and there was a half-second where he could see the man sighting on him and knew with the flat clarity of bad math that there wasn't enough time. The bullet took him through the left thigh. He went down. The second one hit his ribs on the right side. He'd been shot before, twice, once badly, once less so. He knew the particular awful physics of it, the impact, and then the blank moment before the pain arrives, and then the pain arriving all at once, like it's been saving up for the occasion. He went down into the dirt of the canyon floor, and the sand was in his eyes and his mouth, and he tasted copper and grit and heard himself make a sound he didn't intend to make. Josie was at his side. She got her shoulder under his arm and pulled him back behind the boulder, and he helped as much as he could, which wasn't much. His left leg wasn't cooperating. His ribs were yelling at him with every breath. "How bad?" she said. Her voice was level, focused. "Thigh and ribs," he managed. "Not the lung. I'd know." She pressed her hand hard against the thigh wound, and he gritted his teeth and let her. She had the Colt in her other hand and kept her eyes moving while she held pressure. The firing from the rim had stopped. That was worse. When men stopped shooting, it was because they'd found a better move. Wyatt raised his head and looked south, through the blowing sand, and what he saw stopped everything in him cold. At the south end of the canyon, where the passage opened up to the flats, a figure on horseback sat on the ridge above. Not one of the gunmen. Not Boone. The figure was larger, broader, with the posture of a man who had never once doubted that the world would arrange itself to his specifications. Thaddeus Vance. He was exactly what Wyatt had imagined from 100 miles of reputation. 60 years old and built like something carved out of bad weather. He sat his horse like he'd bought the animal and the ground under it and the air above it. He wore black. Of course he wore black. At his feet, on the ground at the edge of the ridge, was Doc Garza, beaten, bound at the wrists. Alive, Wyatt could see the rise and fall of his chest, but barely. His face was turned away, and even at this distance Wyatt could see the damage. Vance's voice came down through the howling storm, amplified somehow by the canyon walls, filling the space between the rocks with a sound like gravel and contempt. "Step out, little girl," he called, "or I blow this old man's brains out and burn your cowboy alive right here." The wind screamed. Josie didn't move for 1 second. Then 2. Wyatt got his hand on her arm. He gripped it as hard as he could, which wasn't as hard as he wanted to. "Don't," he said. Don't do it. She looked at him. He'll kill Garza anyway, Wyatt said. You know he will. Once he has the ledger, Garza doesn't have the ledger, she said. He kept copies. The originals are with us. She glanced down at the saddlebag on the ground beside them, the leather parcel tucked inside it. Then we hold, Wyatt said. We stay down and we hold. She looked at him, at his leg, at the blood that had soaked through and was darkening the dirt around them. He watched her look at it, and he watched her face, and he watched her arrive at whatever calculation she was making in the privacy of her own mind. How much blood have you lost? She asked. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. He pressed his lips together. He was going gray at the edges. He could feel it. The particular cold that moved in, around the borders of consciousness when the body was spending faster than it could afford to. Josie, I'm not going to let you bleed out in a canyon, she said. Her voice was completely steady, like a woman who had made a decision and moved to the other side of it. And I'm not going to let him kill that old man. She moved before he could stop her. She pressed the Colt into his hand as she stood. She tucked the saddlebag with the parcel under his arm. Then she stepped around the boulder and into the open passage of the canyon. The wind hit her full on, sand raking across her face and her clothing, and she walked into it anyway. Walked upright, no crouch, no hurry, straight toward the south passage where Vance sat on his ridge above. Wyatt pushed himself up on one arm and watched her through burning, sand-blasted eyes. She got 20 feet out into the open before Vance's men came down from both sides. 4 of them, moving fast, rifles leveled. One of them got behind her, and one got beside her, and she stood still and let them, her hands up and open, the wind tearing her hair loose and driving it across her face. She turned her head, just enough to look back at Wyatt through the gap between the boulders. He could see her face through the blowing sand. Just barely, just enough. She mouthed 2 words. Liv, I'll wait for you. Then Vance's men closed around her and pulled her hands behind her back, and the sand swallowed everything again, the wind filling all the space that she'd just been standing in. And Wyatt's arm gave out, and he went down into the dirt. He could hear somewhere above and ahead the sound of boots on rock and men calling to each other through the storm, and then the retreating beat of horses moving away south. Then Vance's laugh, carrying back through the canyon on the tail of the wind, satisfied and full of itself and very far away. Then nothing. Wyatt lay in the dirt of Deadman's Canyon, with blood pooling beneath him, and the saddlebag pressed against his chest, and Josie's face still in his eyes, clear and steady even through the sand, even through the dark that was closing around his vision. Live. He pressed his hand down hard on his own thigh. He focused on the pain. Pain meant consciousness. Consciousness meant choice. Choice meant he could still do something about all of this. He kept his hand on the wound. He breathed. He did not close his eyes. The cellar smelled like old earth, and something that had been wet too long. Josie sat with her back against the stone wall, and her wrists in front of her, chained to an iron ring, bolted into the floor. The chain was long enough that she could sit or lie down, but not stand fully upright. That was deliberate. Everything about this room was deliberate. The darkness, which was total, except for a thin line of pale light under the door. The cold, which came up through the earth floor and moved through her clothing like it was searching for something. The silence, which was not quite silence because you could hear, if you listened, the sounds of the compound above and around her. Boots on floorboards. Men's voices. Horses. There were other people in the cellar. She'd known it before she could see them. She'd heard breathing, slow and careful, the breathing of people trying not to draw attention to themselves. When her eyes had adjusted to the dark, she'd counted. 3 women and 3 men, chained like her to rings in the floor, spaced around the walls. Nobody had spoken yet. They'd watched her arrive, watched the guards chain her and leave, watched the door close. Then they'd watched her in the dark, with the patient wariness of people who had learned that trust was a resource you spent carefully. She understood that. She didn't push it. She sat and breathed and thought about Wyatt. She'd seen the blood. She'd had her hand pressed against the wound in his thigh for nearly 2 minutes before she stood up. And she knew what 2 minutes of that kind of bleeding meant. She'd made the calculation, and she'd made the choice. And she did not regret the choice. But that didn't mean she could sit in the dark and not think about what she'd left behind in that canyon. Live, she'd told him. She needed that to be true. She needed it more than she'd needed most things in her life. And she was a woman who'd had to need things at high cost before. She closed her eyes. She went through what she knew. Garza had been alive on that ridge. Beaten but alive, which meant Vance wanted him for something, either as continued leverage or because killing a man with a law degree and a federal network was a different kind of trouble than Vance was ready for. The parcel was with Wyatt. Copies existed, Garza had said, so the night they'd delivered the ledger. Even if Vance got the originals, the copies existed. The case existed. She opened her eyes. The door at the top of the cellar stairs opened. Light came in before he did. Lamplight, warm and grotesque in its warmth, given everything around it. Then Thaddeus Vance came down the stairs, and he took up space the way certain men did. Not just physical space, but all the other kinds, the air in the room rearranging itself around his presence. He was older up close than he'd looked on the ridge. Lines cut deep in his face, gray at his temples. But his eyes were bright with the particular sharp attention of a man who slept well, because he'd stopped feeling things that might otherwise disturb his sleep. He carried a lamp in one hand and something in the other, small, rectangular, and Josie's chest locked up before she even consciously registered what she was looking at. A photograph. Her father's photograph. The one she'd carried in the breast pocket of her dress for 8 years, worn at the edges, the image fading, Robert Mercer sitting stiff-backed in a chair and looking at the camera with the serious expression he always wore when someone pointed anything at him. She'd lost it when they'd searched her after the canyon. She hadn't let herself think about that yet. Vance came to a stop in the middle of the room. He held the lamp up and looked around at the people chained to the walls the way you looked around. A room you'd furnished yourself and were satisfied with. He looked at Josie last and longest. "You caused me considerable inconvenience," he said. His voice was even and conversational, like he was discussing a billing error. She didn't answer. "The ledger," he said. "Where is it?" "Gone," she said. "Well past you." His expression didn't change. "There are no copies that would hold in a federal court. The originals are what matter. Your old doctor friend understood that before our conversation concluded." She kept her face still. She was very good at keeping her face still. 8 years of practice. Vance looked at her for another moment. Then he looked down at the photograph in his hand. "Your father," he said. It wasn't a question. He turned it over, held it close to the lamp, examined it the way you'd examine something you were about to discard. Robert Mercer sat in his chair and looked at the camera and didn't know what was coming. Couldn't know all those years ago when the shutter clicked, and he was just a man sitting for a portrait and thinking about going home. Vance tilted the photograph toward the lamp flame. "No," Josie said. It came out sharp. She hadn't meant it to. She heard it leave her, and hated herself for it because it gave him exactly what he was looking for, the exact nerve he'd been probing for since he came down those stairs. He saw it, too. He let the edge of the photograph touch the flame. It caught at the corner, small and orange, eating into the image from the bottom right. Her father's shoes first, then his legs. The fire moved upward slowly, unhurriedly, while Vance held it between 2 fingers and watched her face. She made herself stop looking at the photograph. She looked at his face instead. She watched him, watching her. She kept her jaw level and her breathing even, and she let it burn. When it was too close to his fingers to hold any longer, he let it drop to the earth floor, and they both watched the last of it curl and go dark. Her father's face was the last piece to go. Vance crouched down in front of her. Up close, he smelled of tobacco and saddle leather. And money, The specific smell of a man who'd never gone without anything. He looked at her with those bright, careful eyes. "You will hang tomorrow morning," he said. "Public, in the main yard. I find that examples work best when they're witnessed." He stood. "E- Every person in this compound will see it. Every person on every ranch in 20 miles will hear about it by nightfall. That's the point." He straightened his coat. "The ledger will turn up. These things always do. And whatever remains of your father's little project will be ash before the federal government finishes its paperwork." He went back up the stairs. The door closed. The dark came back. Josie sat with the chain in her lap and the small warm patch on the earth floor where the photograph had burned, and she breathed in and out, slow and deliberate. From the shadows to her left, a voice. Female, younger than Josie probably, rough at the edges from cold and fear. "Is it true? Tomorrow morning?" "That's what he said," Josie answered. Silence. Then a man's voice from the far wall, older. "There's no way out of these chains." Josie looked down at her wrists. The iron was old but solid. The ring in the floor was set deep. She could feel when she pulled that the give wasn't enough to matter. "I know," she said. "Then we're done," the young woman said. Josie listened to the dark, to the breathing of 6 people who had been here long enough to stop looking for exits. She thought about her father, patient and precise at his accounting desk, recording every number twice to make sure it balanced. She thought about Wyatt on the canyon floor, pressing his hand to his own wound and refusing to close his eyes. She thought about what she'd said to Wyatt in the barn, the night she'd first shown him the brand, that she'd been forced into this life, that she hadn't chosen any of it, and what he'd said back later, quieter, about the moment he'd decided to stop being the man he was becoming. You got to decide what to do with what had been done to you. That was the thing. That was always the thing. She sat up straighter against the wall. "Listen to me," she said. My name is Josephine Mercer. I've been where you are. Not this room, but this place, this exact feeling. 8 years of it." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you this is easy. I'm not going to tell you help is coming, because I don't know that. I don't know what's coming." No one spoke. "What I know," she said, "is that every person in this room is a person, not property, not an example, not a warning to be made of someone else. A person." Her voice was low and steady, and she meant every word of it, the way you meant something you'd arrived at through suffering rather than reading. "He burned a photograph tonight because he thought it would break me. It didn't, because what was in that photograph is in me. My father taught me that a person's value isn't assigned by whoever holds the chain. It's not something that can be taken." She heard someone shift in the dark, a chain moving against the floor. "He wants to hang us in the morning as an example," she continued. "He wants the people watching to see what happens when you don't comply. He wants them to learn that resisting costs everything." She let that sit. "But we're still here tonight. And a person who is still here still has choices." "What choices?" the old man said. "We're chained to the floor." "Right now we are," Josie said. Another silence. "What does that mean?" the young woman asked. Josie reached into the neck of her dress. She had nothing there anymore. They'd searched her thoroughly. But she pressed her fingers to the inside hem of her collar, working it slowly, checking each inch of the stitching. Her fingertip found it. Cold, curved, no larger than the nail of her smallest finger. The horseshoe nail. She pulled it out and held it in her palm, feeling the small, rough shape of it. She thought about Wyatt's hand pressed to hers in the canyon, the moment before Vance's men closed in, the press of something small and metal against her skin, quick and deliberate, a thing done in 2 seconds while his hands were supposedly just gripping her arm. He'd known, even going down, even losing blood, he'd known what might happen, and he'd given her what he had. She closed her fingers around the nail. "Tell me your names," she said. One by one they did. The young woman was Clara. The old man was Hector. The others Miguel, Ruth, Sam, Dora. She repeated each name back as they gave it. Named in the dark, one by one, because names were the first thing that got taken. and the first thing that needed to be given back. "I'm going to work on my lock," she said. "It's going to take time. While I work, talk to each other. Tell each other things." "Stay awake. Why awake?" Ruth asked. "Because we're not done yet," Josie said. She set the nail to the keyhole of the padlock on her chain and started to work. She'd picked locks before, twice, under worse light than this, which was no light at all, purely by feel. Her father had taught her that too, in the abstract, the way a careful man taught his daughter about the ways the world might become hostile, hoping she'd never need it, and knowing she might. The mechanism inside the lock was simple. Older than Vance probably realized. 3 tumblers, not 4. She found the first one inside the first 20 minutes and held it while she worked the second. Around her, people talked, quietly at first, then steadier. Names, and where they'd come from, and how they'd arrived here, and what they'd left behind. She listened and worked and listened and worked. Clara, it turned out, had been a schoolteacher before Vance's men took her farm. Hector had run cattle for 30 years on land his father had broken. Miguel had a wife and 2 boys somewhere north of the valley who didn't know what had happened to him. Josie worked the lock and listened to the lives in the room. The second tumbler took another 30 minutes. The third one she found by accident, chasing the second, and the padlock opened with a small click that sounded enormous in the quiet cellar. She sat still for 1 full second. Then she slipped the chain from her wrists. She stood. Her legs were unsteady, half asleep from sitting on the cold ground. She steadied herself against the wall and breathed and waited for the feeling to come back. "You did it," Clara whispered. "Stay quiet," Josie said. "Stay where you are." She crossed the cellar by feel and found the wall where she'd heard Hector's voice. She knelt in front of his lock and set the nail to the keyhole again. It went faster the second time, third, fourth, fifth. She understood the mechanism now. Her fingers had found the logic of it, and each lock opened cleaner than the last. By the time she'd freed all 6 of them, her hands were shaking, and her eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes in the dark. 6 people standing differently than they'd been sitting, straighter, heads up. She crossed to the stairs and found what she was looking for in the storage corner beside them. The heavy iron bar used to secure the door from the inside. She'd heard the guards use it, heard the sound it made being set and lifted. She picked it up. It was solid and long and weighed more than she'd expected. She turned and faced the room. 6 people looked back at her. "We either die like animals on the gallows," she said quietly, "or we fight and die as free people." A long beat of silence. Then Hector stood up, fully, put his shoulders back. "Free people," he said. One by one, the others answered. Josie set the iron bar back in her hands and walked to the door at the top of the stairs, and she hit the lock on it 3 times until it gave. The door swung open. Cool night air and the smell of fire and open ground hit her face, and behind her 6 people came up the stairs and into it, and the compound of Thaddeus Vance spread out before them in the dark. And Josie looked at the armory building across the yard and knew exactly what she was going to do next. He woke to the sound of drums, or what he thought were drums. He was wrong about that. What he was actually hearing was his own heartbeat, loud and very present, which he decided was the finest sound he'd heard in years, because it meant the alternative hadn't happened yet. Wyatt opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was made of woven reeds and bent willow branches. Close and dim the light, inside soft and brown. He was lying on something that was not the dirt floor of the canyon, which represented an improvement. He was also warm. His thigh was bound. His ribs were wrapped tight enough to make each breath a conscious decision. He turned his head. There was a woman sitting 2 feet from him. She was perhaps 60 years old, small and compact, with silver hair pulled back and dark eyes that were currently assessing him with the no-nonsense thoroughness of someone taking inventory. "You're awake," she said. She spoke in accented English, precise and unhurried. "Where am I?" he managed. "Safe," she said. "That's the most important part." He pushed himself up on his elbows. The ribs screamed at him, and he set his teeth and kept moving. The woman put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down with more authority than he'd expected from someone half his size. "Don't," she said. "You lost a great deal of blood. Moving fast will cost you time you don't have." He lay back. He stared at the woven ceiling and thought about the canyon, and Josie standing up from behind that boulder and walking out into the open with the wind tearing at her, both hands raised. The thing she'd done had saved his life. He knew that with the cold, flat certainty of a man who understood the math of gunshot wounds. If Vance's men had pushed in after she stepped out, he'd have bled out before he could have done anything useful about it. She'd traded herself to keep him breathing. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "How long?" he asked. "3 days," the woman said. 3 days. Josie had been in Vance's hands for 3 days. He sat up. This time the woman put both hands on his shoulders, and he was genuinely surprised by the resistance. She was strong in the way of someone who had done physical work their entire life. "Listen to me," she said, sitting up. "Yes. Getting up? No, not yet. There's someone here who needs to speak with you first." She stepped back and lifted the woven curtain that served as a door. A man came in, middle-aged, lean and dark-haired, with a scar along his left jawline and alert, watchful eyes. He wore a combination of clothes that didn't belong to any one tradition, and he moved through the small space with the ease of someone on familiar ground. He sat cross-legged on the ground opposite Wyatt. "My name is Chato," he said. "My people found you in the canyon. 3 of my men pulled you out from behind those rocks before Vance's crew came back to clean up." He studied Wyatt. "Doc Garza sent word to us 2 days ago. He's alive. Hurt, but alive. He got himself loose and made it to a relay station outside Crestfall. He's filed with the federal marshal." Wyatt processed that. "The ledger," he said. "Garza has copies. He says the copies are sufficient. He says the federal marshal agrees." Chato tilted his head. "The woman, Mercer. You care about her." It wasn't phrased as a question. "Yes," Wyatt said. Chato nodded once. "Vance has her at the compound. He announced a public hanging tomorrow morning." He held Wyatt's eyes. "That's why I'm telling you now, and not waiting until you're stronger." "Tomorrow morning?" Wyatt looked at the ceiling for a long moment. He thought about the photograph that Josie kept pressed against her ribs when she slept. He thought about the way she'd said her father's name, plain and undecorated, the name of someone she'd loved and lost and was still carrying. He thought about the lock she'd picked. In 8 seconds flat on his practice padlock, the afternoon they'd spent killing time before leaving for Crestfall, her fingers working it, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done it before and didn't want to need to. He thought about a brand burned into a woman's shoulder by a man who believed that owning things was the same as being entitled to them. He thought about all the men he'd put in the ground over 15 years and all the ones he hadn't, and the particular calculation he'd been making in the back of his mind since the moment Josie had walked out from behind that boulder. The anger in him was quiet. That was the thing about real anger, the kind that had been sitting long enough to set. It didn't rattle around. It just sat there, solid and patient, waiting to be useful. He pushed himself up to sitting. The room tilted slightly. He waited it out. "I need my gear," he said. Chato looked at him steadily. "It's here. Your horse is here. Your weapons are here." He paused. "The question is whether you can ride." "I can ride. You took 2 bullets 3 days ago." "I've ridden with worse." He met Chato's eyes. "I have to go." Chato studied him for a long moment. Whatever he found in Wyatt's face appeared to settle the question for him, because he stood. "My men will ride with you to the county road," he said. "After that, you're in Vance's territory, and I can't take them further without starting something larger than one man's rescue." "I understand," Wyatt said. "I'm not asking for that. Doc Garza asked me to tell you something." Chato reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded note, held it out. Wyatt took it, unfolded it, with fingers that were steadier than he had any right to expect. The handwriting was cramped and slanted, written in a hurry. She gave me the document in the saddlebag you carried out of the canyon. Federal Marshal Henderson rides for Blackwood County by week's end. Hold until then if you can. If you cannot, do what you must. Garza Wyatt refolded the note. If you cannot do what you must, he handed the note back. Can you stand? Chato asked. Give me a minute. He sat on the edge of the sleeping mat and put both feet flat on the ground and breathed. His left leg was a sustained argument against him, tight and burning, where the wound had been packed and bound. His ribs were an ongoing negotiation, each inhale costing a small specific amount that he was going to have to keep paying. He cataloged all of it and set it aside. Then he stood. The room moved. He held himself still and waited, and the room stopped moving. There, he said. The woman with the silver hair appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that managed to be simultaneously disapproving and resigned, which was the exact look of a healer who had worked on enough stubborn people to know when the argument was already lost. She handed him a small clay jar. For the leg. Change the dressing tonight and put this on the wound. If it goes hot again, you stop and you rest. You understand me? Yes, ma'am, he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she stepped aside and let him through. The camp was small and organized, tucked into a wide canyon shelf that the landscape had essentially hidden from the outside. There were perhaps 30 people. Most of them went about their business, without looking at him, which he appreciated. His horse was tied at the far edge of the camp, saddled already. His saddlebags were laid over the fence beside it. His rifle was there, cleaned and loaded. Someone had cleaned it and loaded it for him without being asked. He stood in front of the horse for a moment. Then he went to the saddlebags. His duster was folded on top. He'd had it for 11 years. It was weathered through to something beyond color, and it had 3 bullet holes in it from 3 different years and corresponding scars on the body beneath each one. He shook it out and put it on. He took the revolvers from their holsters, both of them, and checked the cylinders. Fully loaded, he spun them once each and holstered them. He took his rifle and ran a hand along the barrel. Somewhere in the camp, out of sight, someone began to beat a slow rhythm on a small drum. Low and steady and patient, one of the young men from the camp appeared at his elbow. He was perhaps 20, solemn-faced, carrying something in both hands. A small clay bowl, and in it, gray-black ash. Wyatt looked at him. The young man looked back. Wyatt understood. He'd heard about this. He'd spent enough years in this country to know what was being offered. He nodded. The young man dipped 2 fingers in the ash and reached up. He drew a line across Wyatt's left cheekbone, then the right, then a third marked the center of his forehead. Slow and deliberate, each one. Wyatt stood still and let it be done. When the young man stepped back, Chato was behind him. You understand what you're wearing, Chato said. It was a statement. I understand, Wyatt said. You're not going to make an arrest. No. Then, what are you doing? Wyatt took his rifle and checked the load one more time. He looked at the canyon walls above them, the late afternoon light going gold and long across the rock. He thought about the man he'd been for 15 years, the man who'd kept walking, the man who'd filed papers and collected his payment and gone home and tried not to think too hard about what he'd left behind. He thought about the family he'd failed, years ago, the one that had set him on the road to exile and emptiness, and a ranch at the edge of nowhere, chosen specifically because it required nothing of him. He thought about Josie, walking out into an open canyon with the wind eating at her, buying him time to live with the only currency she had. He was done with walking. I'm going to war, he said. He put his boot in the stirrup and mounted his horse, and the pain in his leg was real and bright, and he settled into the saddle anyway and gathered the reins. 4 of Chato's men mounted up beside him. He looked at them, and they looked at him, and nobody said anything unnecessary because there was nothing unnecessary to say. He touched his heels to the horse. They rode south toward the county road, toward Blackwood Valley, toward the last stand of a cattle baron who had made the fatal mistake of believing that because he had power over people, he had power over all of them. He'd missed one. The sun was going down, and the ash was on his face, and Wyatt Hayes rode like what he was becoming, which was the last thing Thaddeus Vance would ever see coming. The drumbeat faded behind him as he cleared the canyon mouth. In front of him, the valley lay flat and dark against the darkening sky, and somewhere in the middle of it, in a cellar beneath a compound full of armed men, Josie Mercer was waiting. He'd told her once that scars were proof you'd survived. He intended to make sure she got more of them. He rode. The compound went quiet around 2 in the morning. Josie had been counting the sounds above her since they'd put her back in the cellar. The rotation of guards, every 90 minutes, 2 men at the main gate, 1 at the armory, 1 walking the perimeter. She'd tracked the pattern across 2 full rotations before she was certain of it. She didn't have a watch. She counted by heartbeats, and patience, which her father had taught her, were the same thing in different clothes. She pressed her ear to the cellar door and listened. The guard outside had walked his last check 20 minutes ago. She'd heard his boots on the ground overhead, the particular rhythm of a man, doing a job he'd done so many times it no longer required his attention. He'd move again in another 70 minutes if the pattern held. She stepped back from the door. Behind her, 6 people stood in the dark and waited. They were ready. They'd been ready for an hour, silent and still, because Josie had asked them to be, and because she'd opened their locks and led them up the stairs, and for reasons they all understood, without anyone saying it, that had earned her something. She looked at them in the thin dark. Hector had found the iron bar she'd set down to deal with the locks, and he'd picked it up and kept it. Clara was at the back of the group, small and coiled. Miguel and Sam stood together, their combined weight and height representing the most substantial physical resource Josie had available to her. Ruth and Dora were behind them, quiet and sharp-eyed. 7 people against a compound full of armed men. She wasn't going to pretend those were good odds. She looked down at her hands. She had the horseshoe nail, which was no kind of weapon. She had whatever was on the other side of this door, and whatever she could find in the next 30 seconds. And she had the fact that Thaddeus Vance expected her to still be chained to the floor. That was the one advantage that mattered. She set her shoulder against the cellar door and pushed it open. The night air hit her like cold water. She stood still in the doorway for 3 full seconds, scanning. The yard was wide and open, packed dirt, the main gate ahead, and to the left, the bunkhouse to the right, dark windows along its face. The armory building was straight ahead, 40 feet away, a low stone structure with a heavy padlocked door. One man, between her and the armory, he was leaning against the wall of the bunkhouse, head tipped back, not quite asleep, but not fully elsewhere either. His rifle rested against the wall beside him. Josie looked back at the people behind her. She pointed at the man, then at Miguel and Sam. Then she held up a flat hand, slow, easy. They understood. Miguel and Sam moved out of the cellar ahead of the others, quiet across the packed earth, and by the time the guard registered that something was wrong, they were already on him. Miguel got the rifle away from the wall before the man could grab it, and Sam had him by the collar, and Hector was there 3 seconds later with the iron bar raised. The guard looked at the bar and at the number of people in front of him and made the intelligent decision. "Don't," Sam said, and that was enough. They had him on the ground and bound with his own belt and a strip torn from his own shirt in under a minute. No shots fired, no shouts. Josie crossed to the armory door. The lock was different from the cellar locks, newer, heavier. She worked the horseshoe nail into it and felt the mechanism and knew within 30 seconds that she wasn't going to be able to pick this one. The tolerances were too tight. She'd need something else. She looked at Hector and the iron bar. He looked at the lock. He stepped up beside her, set the bar against the lock shackle at an angle, and hit it 3 times in fast succession. The third blow cracked the hasp away from the door frame entirely, old wood splitting around old screws, and the door swung inward. The sound was not quiet. From the bunkhouse 20 feet away, she heard voices. Movement, go, she said. They went. Inside the armory were rifles, handguns, ammunition cases, 3 kegs of black powder, and a rack of tools along the left wall. Josie went straight to the handguns, loaded one in 12 seconds, passed it to Clara, loaded another and kept it. Miguel took a rifle. Sam took 2. Hector set down the iron bar and picked up a shotgun and broke it to check the load. The bunkhouse door opened and 2 men came out with lanterns and voices. Josie stepped out of the armory doorway. She raised the handgun. The 2 men stopped. 4 more appeared behind them. The yard was getting light as more lanterns came on inside the bunkhouse, and she could hear shouting. Now, more movement, the situation unraveling from manageable to something else in the span of a few breaths. She kept the gun level. "These people behind me aren't going back to that cellar," she said. Her voice carried across the yard, flat and clear. "No waver in it. Tell your friends to stay inside." The 2 men in front looked at the gun, then at the doorway where Miguel and Sam stood with rifles, then at each other. One of them reached for his holster. Hector fired the shotgun. He aimed high, deliberately, over the heads of the men, and the blast took out the top of a fence post behind them, and the sound of it cracked the night wide open. Every head ducked, every hand stopped moving. The silence after was ringing and total. "Last time," Josie said. "Tell them to stay inside." Nobody moved. Then a man at the back of the group spoke quietly to the one beside him, and the message went forward through the group, and slowly, one by one, hands came up away from holsters. Josie looked at Clara. "The powder kegs," she said. Clara understood. She went back into the armory and came out with the first keg in her arms and set it in the middle of the yard, then the second, then the third. She cracked the stoppers on all 3, and a dark trail of powder began spreading across the packed earth. Josie looked at the men by the bunkhouse. "Get back inside," she said. "You'll blow yourself up along with us," one of them said. "Maybe," she said. "Go inside, and you'll never find out." They went inside. She heard the bolt being drawn on the other side, which told her they weren't stupid. They knew what a door was worth against black powder, but it also meant they weren't coming out. In the next 60 seconds, which was all she needed, she looked at her people. "The main gate," she said. "Now move." They moved. She waited until they were past her, all 6 of them, running for the gate. Then she pulled the lamp from the bracket on the armory wall. She touched the flame to the powder trail. It caught immediately, blue-white and hissing, racing across the yard faster than she'd expected. She ran. She was 10 steps from the gate when the armory went up. The blast hit her in the back like a flat wall of air and lifted her feet off the ground and set them back down again, 2 steps forward from where she'd been. And the sound of it was enormous. Past sound, really. Something you felt in your back teeth and your chest simultaneously. She caught herself on the gate post and looked back. The armory was a column of fire. The bunkhouse windows had blown in on the side facing it. She could hear men shouting. The particular shouting of people checking themselves for damage. The main house, 60 feet further back, had lights coming on in every window. Josie looked at the 7 of them through the gate. Standing. All of them. She pulled the gate open the rest of the way. "Run," she said. "South Road, through the cottonwoods, there's a creek bed a mile out. Get into it, and stay down and keep moving east." "What about you?" Clara asked. "I'll be right behind you." Clara looked at her for a long second, with those schoolteacher's eyes that had seen too much, and still somehow hadn't lost their fundamental decency. "Come behind us." "Then," she said firmly, "don't you dare stay." "Go," Josie said. They went. Josie stood at the gate and looked back at the burning compound and thought about Wyatt, and she thought about what came next. And she thought about her father sitting stiff-backed in a chair, looking at a camera, not knowing what was coming, and she thought about the fact that she knew exactly what was coming, and she was still standing here. Then she heard horses from the north road moving fast, a lot of them. She gripped the gatepost and looked into the dark. The first rider came out of the black and into the firelight from the burning armory, and she saw the duster first, then the hat, then the ash-marked face beneath it, and everything in her chest did something she didn't have a name for. He was on horseback and moving, and he was the most alive thing she'd seen in 3 days. Wyatt pulled up his horse 10 feet from the gate and looked down at her, and the burning compound behind her, and the gun in her hand. "You already started without me," he said. "You were late," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him then. Men were pouring out of the main house and the broken bunkhouse, and the moment was over, replaced by something much louder. The yard turned into a war. Wyatt was off his horse, and through the gate, before the first shot came from the main house. He pulled Josie behind the gate post, put his back to it, and did a fast read of the yard. Armory still burning. Bunkhouse half collapsed on the near side from the blast. Main house straight ahead, 60 feet. Lights in all the windows. Muzzle flashes starting from the lower level. He counted the flashes. 6 guns, maybe 8. He looked at Josie. She looked back at him, clear-eyed and steady with a loaded handgun, and the Colt he'd given her back in her belt, where she'd apparently gotten it back from somewhere. And he thought that, however the next 20 minutes went, he had never in his life been less worried about someone's ability to handle themselves. "How many inside?" he said. "When I came out, there were 6 in the yard. I don't know the house. Vance? Last I saw him, he was in the main house." Wyatt checked his rifle. He looked at the men who'd ridden down with him from Chato's camp, 4 of them, spread behind the gate, and the fence posts on either side. They were holding positions, drawing fire, keeping Vance's men focused on the gate. "I'm going right," he said to Josie. "There's a gap between the bunkhouse and the storage shed. Gets me to the side of the main house without crossing open ground. I'm coming with you." "I know." He went right, low and fast, and she was with him, step for step. The bunkhouse wall was still intact on this side, shielded from the armory blast. They ran along it in the shadow, and Wyatt went through the gap without slowing, came up against the storage shed wall, checked the angle to the main house. A man came around the corner of the shed and walked straight into Wyatt's rifle barrel. Wyatt hit him once with the stock, clean and economical, and the man went down and stayed there. He kept moving. The main house had a side door, service entrance, heavy wood. He hit it with his shoulder, and it gave on the second blow, and they were inside, in a passage that smelled of food and lamp oil. Voices at the far end, the front of the house, the sound of shooting, and men calling positions to each other. He went forward. He moved through the house the way he'd moved through bad places, all his adult life, not fast, not slow, deliberate. Every doorway checked before he cleared it. Every room read in 3 seconds and left. It was a specific skill, and a terrible one to have spent years acquiring. But it was useful now. He went through the front room, cleared the 2 men at the windows with 2 shots that were close enough together to sound like one, and came out onto the front porch of the main house. The yard in front of him was smoke and firelight, and the ongoing crack of rifle fire from the gate. He could see his 4 riders working well. They were smart about cover, not trying to push forward, just holding pressure, keeping Vance's remaining men pinned between the gate and the burning armory. It was working, but Vance wasn't in the yard. Wyatt scanned left, right. The far fence line, the stable. The doors were open, and a horse was being brought out, saddled and loaded with saddlebags that hung heavy, gold heavy, and the man leading it was moving with the particular controlled urgency of someone who had already decided the battle was lost and was now concerned only with the next problem. Thaddeus Vance came out of the stable doorway, pulling his horse, his black coat smoke-stained, his bright eyes moving across the compound with the assessing calculation of a man totaling up what he was willing to abandon. He wasn't looking at the main house yet. He was looking at the gate. Wyatt stepped off the porch. He walked across the yard at a measured pace, through the drifting smoke, past a man who was on the ground and deciding to stay there, past the burning remains of the armory, and he walked with his rifle in both hands and the ash still on his face, and Vance's compound coming apart around him in fire and noise, and he didn't hurry once. He was 40 feet from Vance when Josie cleared the far corner of the bunkhouse. Vance saw her first. He let go of the horse's reins and the saddlebags and went for his holster in one motion, and he was fast, genuinely fast, the speed of a man who had not gotten to where he was by being slow about anything. He had the gun leveled at Josie before she'd cleared another step. "Don't," he said. She stopped. Wyatt stopped. He had his rifle up, but the angle wasn't clean. Josie was too close to the line. He held the bead on Vance's chest and watched Vance's gun on Josie, and nobody moved. The compound had gone quiet around them. The shooting had stopped. Men on both sides were watching. Vance looked at Wyatt. "Put it down," Vance said, "or she gets the first bullet." Wyatt looked at him, at the gun, at Josie. He lowered the rifle to his side. Vance kept his gun on Josie and reached back for the horse's reins with his free hand. He was going to ride out. He thought he could still ride out. Wyatt reached into his coat. He drew the second revolver, not his own, a spare he'd taken from Chado's supply, specifically for this purpose. He held it up so Vance could see it clearly. Then he tossed it, underhand, easy, 5 feet to Vance's right. It landed in the dirt. Vance looked at the gun, looked at Wyatt. "Pick it up," Wyatt said. "We'll finish this the right way." Something moved through Vance's face. Pride, maybe, or its uglier cousin, the need to be seen as unafraid. Whatever it was, it made the decision for him. He looked at Josie, and then at the revolver, and then he lowered his gun a half-inch, calculating the distance, the sequence, what order he needed to do things in. He bent toward the revolver. Then he came up fast, not picking it up, spinning left with his own gun already swinging toward Wyatt, not toward the revolver, cheating the draw before Wyatt's hand could reach his holster. A shot cracked from Josie's direction. Vance's gun hand jerked. The revolver went sideways into the dirt and didn't go off because his finger had already left the trigger. He made a sound and grabbed his right hand with his left and looked at it with the genuine astonishment of a man for whom consequences had always happened to other people. Josie was standing with the Colt in both hands, smoke rising from the barrel, her feet set in the stance she'd practiced once at a fence post on a quiet morning that felt like a different life. Vance was on his knees in the dirt, holding his gun hand, his bright eyes gone from calculating to something raw underneath. Wyatt walked forward until he was standing over Vance. He reached down and picked up the revolver. Vance had cheated on and tucked it into his belt. He looked at Vance on the ground for a long moment. Then he turned and crossed to the burning remains of the armory. The fire had died down to a fierce, concentrated burn, and at the edge of it, where the heat was intense but survivable if you were quick, he could see the branding iron, still there, its long handle charred. The TV head glowing deep red, working back toward orange. He took his coat off and wrapped it around the handle. He picked it up. The heat came through the coat and into his palm, and he carried it back across the yard to where Vance was kneeling in the dirt, and he stopped in front of him and looked down. Vance looked up at the glowing iron. Whatever had been bright and calculating in his eyes was gone now. What was left was something smaller and older and afraid. "Please," Vance said. He said it quietly. Barely a sound. Wyatt looked at the iron in his hand. He looked at the TV, burned into the metal. The same letters he'd seen on Josie's shoulder by lantern light in his barn. He looked at Vance's face, wet with effort and fear, and he felt the anger in him, that solid, patient anger, come to the surface for the first time. He stepped forward. A hand closed around his arm. Josie. He looked at her. She was standing at his side with the Colt still in her hand and the smoke and firelight moving across her face and her eyes on his, steady and clear. She didn't say anything. She just held his arm. He stood still. She reached over and took the iron from his hand. Her grip on it was firm through the coat. She stood over Vance, and she looked down at him for a long moment. Vance, who had burned her, Vance, who had killed her father and taken 8 years of her life and burned the only photograph she had of the man who'd taught her everything good she knew. Vance, who was kneeling in the dirt of his own burning compound, weeping. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned to the fire behind her and hurled the iron into it. It went deep into the coals and vanished, and the fire took it. She turned back to Vance. "You don't get to turn me into a monster like you," she said. Her voice was cold and clean and final. Vance sat in the dirt and wept, and that was the most diminished thing she'd ever seen. Not satisfying. Not the way she'd imagined it might be, in the long dark of the cellar, or in the years before that. Just small. Just a man sitting in the dirt of his own making, reduced at last to his actual size. Wyatt came up beside her. He looked at the fire where the iron had gone, then at Vance, then at the men around the compound, Vance's remaining hired guns, 12 of them standing with their hands visible, with Wyatt's riders behind them, and Josie's 6 freed captives appearing now at the gate. Nobody was going anywhere. He reached into his coat and produced a length of rope. "On your feet," he said to Vance. Vance got up slowly. Wyatt bound his wrists behind him and tied the rope to the fence post and left him there and walked to Josie and stood beside her, and they both looked at the compound burning. Her shoulder was close to his. Their arms were touching. "You saved my life," he said, "in the canyon. You saved mine first. I didn't mean... I know what you meant." She looked at him. "We're even." He looked at her for a moment. "We're not even," he said. "We're something else." She held his gaze. Around them, the fire burned lower, and the smoke drifted, and Vance's compound came apart, piece by piece, in the cooling night air. And somewhere north of them, a week out at most, federal marshals were riding for Blackwood Valley with copies of her father's ledger in their saddlebags. It was over. It was finally completely over. Months passed, they passed, the way time passed after a long war. Not easily, but with a kind of accumulating quiet, that you didn't trust at first, and then gradually did, the way you trusted a healed wound after a while. You pressed on it gently and found it solid, and slowly stopped, expecting it to give way. Federal Marshal Henderson rode into Blackwood Valley 6 days after the night the armory burned. He arrived with 12 men, and a file of documents that Doc Garza had prepared with the meticulous care of a man who had been waiting to do this for years. The Black Ledger, both original and copies, went into federal evidence. The testimony of 6 freed captives went in with it. Josie's own account, given over 2 days in a room with Henderson and Garza and a court stenographer, went in last. Thaddeus Vance went to federal prison awaiting trial before the first frost. Judge Calloway went 2 weeks after. 2 county commissioners followed. The assessor's office was audited by the territorial government, and 3 men inside it were removed and charged. The structure Vance had built over 15 years didn't come down all at once. It came down piece by piece, each piece making the next one easier. The way a wall went, when you found the right to pull, the stolen land took longer. Land always did. Deeds and titles moved through legal channels at the pace of legal channels, which was maddening and necessary in equal measure. But it moved. Hector got his grazing land back before winter. 3 other families had their titles restored by spring. Miguel found his way north to his wife and his boys in November, and Josie received a letter from him in December that she kept pressed in the cover of her father's rebuilt ledger, the one she'd reconstructed from memory and from the copies that had survived. She stayed at Wyatt's ranch. She didn't announce it as a decision. It wasn't the kind of thing that got announced. It was more that she was there, and then she was still there, and the days accumulated, and at some point, it became simply the fact of where she lived. She helped with the horses. She turned out to be better with them than Wyatt was, which he admitted without obvious pain. She built a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, working the ground herself in the early mornings, coming in with dirt under her nails, and the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent too many years watching other people's land grow things. She rode the ridge every afternoon and watched the valley and noted the changes as they came. The families returning to their properties, the first smoke from chimneys that had been cold for years. Wyatt healed. He healed slower than he wanted to, and faster than Chato's healer had predicted, which felt about right for a man who was simultaneously impatient and too stubborn to actually slow down when told to. His leg gave him trouble for 6 weeks, and then stopped. His ribs took 2 months to stop making their opinion known every time he breathed too deeply. He didn't complain about any of it, which Josie noticed, because she noticed everything. She noticed other things too. She noticed that he set an extra cup on the table every morning before she came in from the horses, already knowing she'd want coffee and already knowing how she took it. She noticed that he'd fixed the latch on the back room door, which had been sticking since she'd arrived, without her asking. She noticed that the chair on the porch had been moved slightly to catch the afternoon light better, moved to the angle that was better for the person sitting in it, and she was the person who sat in it in the afternoons. She noticed that he watched her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, and that she did the same. They were not people who talked about things directly. She'd learned that about both of them, and she'd made her peace with it, because the things that needed to be said were getting said in other ways, in the extra cup, and the fixed latch, and the move chair, and the fact that they were both still here. On a morning in late spring, Josie sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge. The valley below was green, with early grass, the best spring anyone could remember, as if the land itself was recovering from what had been done to it. She could see the smoke from 3 separate homesteads to the south, families back on their land, fires lit for breakfast. She set her coffee down and lifted her hair and pinned it up loosely. She was wearing a dress she'd bought herself in Crestfall 2 weeks ago. The first thing she'd owned that she'd chosen without anyone else's permission. It was a light blue cotton, simple, and it had an off-the-shoulder cut that she'd chosen deliberately, specifically because she was done hiding her shoulder. The brand was still there. It would always be there. Scar tissue didn't reverse itself, and she'd made her peace with that, the same way she'd made her peace with a lot of things, by looking at it straight and deciding what it meant and refusing to let it mean anything she hadn't chosen. But over the past 2 months, she'd added something. The tattoo artist in Crestfall had been an old woman who worked out of the back of her home and who had looked at Josie's shoulder for a long time before she said a word. Then she'd nodded once and gone to her inks without asking a single unnecessary question, which was the mark of either great wisdom or great professionalism, and possibly both. She'd taken 4 sessions. Josie tilted her head and looked at her shoulder in the morning light. The desert rose was extraordinary. It started at the center of the brand, its roots spreading in dark ink, tendrils around and through the letters, wrapping through them the way roots wrapped through old stones, patient and persistent, claiming them. The stem rose through the middle and opened at the top into a full bloom, red and amber, petals curling outward like something reaching for sun. The leaves spread across her shoulder in both directions, and small buds clustered at the edges, one of them just beginning to open. It didn't hide the scar. You could still see it, underneath, if you looked. The rose grew through it, rather than over it. That was the point. She heard the door open behind her. Wyatt came out with his coffee and stopped. She felt him stop before she heard it. She felt him looking at her shoulder in the morning light, seeing the rose fully for the first time in this kind of light, which was different from lamplight, which showed everything. He came and sat on the step beside her. He was quiet for a while. Then he set his coffee down and leaned forward and pressed his lips directly onto the rose. Not quickly, deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered to him. His mouth was warm against her skin, and the morning was quiet around them, and the valley spread out, below, green and waking up. She felt him speak against her shoulder. The most beautiful flowers always bloom in the harshest dirt, he said. She closed her eyes for a moment. He straightened and sat back, and they sat side by side on the porch steps with their coffee going cool in their hands and the sun still coming up over the ridge, and the whole valley below them, changed and changing still. "This land is free now," he said, "and so are you." She looked at the valley, at the smoke from the homesteads, at the long, flat morning light that made everything look like a beginning. She leaned her head back against his shoulder and turned her face toward the sun. "We're both free," she said. The sun cleared the ridge. It came out gold and warm and lit up the valley from one end to the other, and the grass went bright with it, and the homestead smoke caught the light and went amber, and the whole of Blackwood Valley lay there in the morning, like something returned to itself after a long absence. Two people sat on a porch step and watched it happen. Neither of them needed to say anything else. Robert Mercer had said once that a ledger balanced, or it told a lie. That was true of more than accounting. He'd said that too. He'd been right about most things, her father. Careful and precise and honest at considerable personal cost. And he'd known it might cost him that much, and he'd done it anyway. The ledger was balanced now. Every debt that had been manufactured from nothing was erased. Every acre of stolen ground had a true name on the deed, or was working its way back to one. The men who had propped up a system designed to tell a lie were answering for it in the slow, grinding way that law moved, which was not fast enough and was still the right way. And here, on this porch, in this particular corner of a valley that was learning to breathe again, a man who had stopped walking away and a woman who had never stopped walking forward had arrived at the same place from different directions. That was the thing about freedom. You couldn't give it to someone. You couldn't take it for them. You could fight for the conditions that made it possible, and you could stand beside someone while they claimed it for themselves. But the claiming was always personal, always at cost. Josie had paid hers. Wyatt had paid his. The sun kept rising. The tracks of everything that had led to this morning were already fading in the warming light, not erased, the way a scar was never really erased, but softened, the edges going gentle, the story still there, for anyone who looked closely enough, but no longer the first and only thing you saw. What you saw first now was the rose. What you saw first now was the light. What you saw first now was two people sitting on a porch at the start of a morning that belonged to them, watching a free valley wake up, and knowing, both of them, down to the bone, that they had earned this quiet with everything they had. That was enough. That was in fact exactly enough. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Josie is standing over Thaddeus Vance. He's on his knees in the dirt of his own burning compound, weeping. She's holding the branding iron, the same one he used to mark her like property, and it's still glowing red. She could do it. Nobody in that yard would have stopped her. Nobody would have blamed her. She throws it into the fire instead. "You don't get to turn me into a monster like you." That one line is the whole story. Everything Wyatt and Josie fought through, every scar, every night in a cellar, every mile through a sandstorm, it all comes down to that single choice. Not the choice to survive. Surviving is just biology. The real choice is who you decide to be on the other side of the worst thing that ever happened to you. That's what this story is actually about. It's not really a story about a bounty hunter and a runaway woman in the Old West. It's about what happens when one person decides that another person's suffering is worth stopping. Wyatt didn't have to lower that rifle in the barn. He had every reason to turn Josie away. She was dangerous. She was hunted. And getting involved meant getting in the way of a man who owned judges and sheriffs and had the whole valley in his pocket. But he looked at what had been done to her, and something in him that had been quietly dying for years came back to life. Compassion is like that. You can bury it under years of hard living and harder choices, but it doesn't actually die. It waits in Josie. Josie is the kind of person this world produces quietly and in large numbers and almost never gives credit to. 8 years. 8 years of manufactured debt and forced labor and watching the people around her break one by one and she came out of it with her mind intact and a plan and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment. She didn't survive by becoming hard. She survived by staying human, which is the harder thing by far. When she was chained in that cellar the night before her scheduled hanging, her first instinct wasn't to save herself. It was to learn the names of the people around her, because she understood something that Vance never did and never could. A person's dignity isn't something you can burn off with a hot iron. It lives somewhere he didn't have access to. The brand on her shoulder was meant to be a statement of ownership. She turned it into a garden. A desert rose, roots wrapping through the scar growing out of the damage rather than hiding it. That's not a metaphor I invented. That's just what she chose to do, and it says everything. There's also something worth saying about the relationship between Wyatt and Josie, because it would be easy to read this as a story where a strong man saves a helpless woman. That's not what happened. Wyatt saved Josie's life once in the barn by lowering a rifle. Josie saved Wyatt's life once in the canyon by walking into the open. They kept each other alive in equal measure across the whole story, and when it was over, they stood side by side in front of a burning compound and looked at what they'd built together. He didn't rescue her. They rescued each other. And the thing that made that possible wasn't strength or guns or tactical skill, though they needed all of those things. It was the decision, made separately, and then together, to treat the other person as a full human being, worthy of trust and respect. That's rarer than it sounds. The valley at the end of this story is changed. The land is being returned. The corrupt judges are gone. The people who were held in that cellar are free. None of that happened because one man rode in on a horse. It happened because a woman carried a ledger through 8 years of captivity and refused to let it be destroyed. Because a doctor spent years building a case that nobody would help him build until one day someone did. Because 6 people in a dark cellar decided together that dying free was better than living chained. Because a bounty hunter who had spent 15 years walking away from things finally decided to stop. The story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, locations, and situations depicted in this story are entirely imaginary and created solely for entertainment and storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The story contains depictions of historical injustice, forced labor, violence, and abuse intended to serve the narrative's themes of human dignity, resilience, and justice. These elements are not glorified, but examine